an event that can rival a county fair for groaning tables of food, animal exhibits, and Dickensian grotesques worthy of a Midway freak show. And whether Baptist dry or dogged by worries over alcohol poisoning, these affairs, particularly when measured out over decades, take on an organic life that echoes the births, deaths, and personal dramas of the participants. That's certainly true of my mother's family, which has held a yearly late summer reunion since the 1920s. My mother hasn't missed one since 1941, she'll proudly tell you. Started by my great-grandparents' generation, but nurtured along by my grandparents and a gaggle of nearly 24 siblings, these day-long spectacles draw family members from the isolated corners of Virginia to Halifax County, an area south of Lynchburg in the heart of one of the oldest tobacco-producing regions in the country. We would converge on a local community center or, most often, on the spacious grounds of the home of my mother's favorite cousin, Hayden Thomas. His hospitality knew no bounds, nor did his sense of humor, although I think he began to worry some of the family when, in his dotage, he began to take great pleasure in announcing loudly that he wasn't wearing underwear. I remember all of this because naturally I was dragged to the reunion each year from birth until I left home for college. And for most of my childhood, the event was a very ritualized affair, as if my grandfather had drafted a liturgy sprinkled with hymns of, "When will we get there? I need to go to the bathroom, and can we stop for a Coke?" Each year, he and my grandmother would arrive at our home on the appointed Sunday at 5 a.m. sharp. His 1963 Ford Galaxy 500 packed like one of those brain teaser puzzles with coolers, Tupperware, plates, and everything but the kitchen sink. My parents would pack our car quickly while my brother and I would fight over the best spot to sleep in our Gran Torino station wagon. And off we'd go, a few car lengths apart, in a family caravan of 4 hours, driving west across Route 58 through little towns like Disputanta, South Hill, and Robert E. Lee's Appomattox. Although far from summer in those cicada Sunday afternoons, I'm reminded of these reunions and their characters because the dowager wife of a long-deceased great-uncle passed away recently, leaving this world in the childlike stupor of Alzheimer's. Aunt Ida Mae was famous in family circles for her biscuits, as well as the perpetual uncleanliness of her home. We loved the biscuits, but preferred not to contemplate their provenance. Always a little tipsy, Ida Mae was what the elderly ladies of the clan called pixelated, a term which refers to one who is overly eccentric or whimsical, or inhabited by pixies. Ida Mae's passing reminded me of the more colorful characters who would show up each August to eat and reminisce. There was Uncle Clyde, who was in charge of lemonade each year. He would arrive with 2 massive 10-gallon stoneware crocks, one for super sweet and one for pucker-inducing sour, and set about making batch after batch for those who eschewed the iced tea for a mason jar full of icy lemonade. He was adored and feared equally for making the lemonade and policing the crocks against dirty hands trying to reach over the lip to steal ice or lemons. As if swatting insects with a fly swatter, he'd smack the fingers of transgressors with the long aluminum ladles used to fill the glasses. His son and successor as lemonade czar, Clyde Jr., served as the embodiment of our family's one cautionary tale. And despite the protestations of our parents, he would delight the children by removing his glass eye, the result of an Independence Day fireworks accident in the 1940s. Aunt Nancy, a member of the Pentecostal Holiness Church, was the permanent bearer of responsibility to say grace and bless the food at the start of each reunion. Nancy would announce her presence with shouts of "Amen" and "Who loves the Lord?" Her blessing, offered over tables of rapidly cooling food, took on the character of a sermon, and one always wondered if she would spice it up with some speaking in tongues or laying on of hands. One of my more irreverent cousins would invariably add his own blessing of the food after Nancy's loud "Amen." He would say, "Good bread, good meat, good God, let's eat." My father, never a keen participant in the more charismatic displays of religious fervor in the family, would predictably remember at the start of Nancy's exhortation some item forgotten in the car. Given the gossipy crowd of clucking hens in attendance, my father's regular vanishing act likely prompted some speculation that perhaps he was ducking behind the house to take a nip at the bottom. As a Methodist, he was already suspect. Finally, we also enjoyed seeing the jovial Uncle Edgar and Aunt Edna, because they always arrived with their little Chihuahua ladybug, who delighted the younger kids with tricks. Edna seemed painfully thin and frail, a condition likely exacerbated by the smoky parade of Benson and Hedges menthol cigarettes that passed her lips non-stop from the instant she stepped from her cavernous Buick to the late afternoon moment when, rising from her folding chair, she would theatrically announce, "I'm going to the John one more time before we leave." Her husband, Edgar, perpetually carried around an erection the way some 8-year-olds carry number 2 pencils, tucked neatly into his pants, but clearly visible. We would try in vain not to stare, and usually excused ourselves quickly to join other cousins in a game of softball or a forbidden climb through one of the tobacco-curing barns at the edge of the estate. Still, despite his evident priapism, Edgar could be counted on for funny anecdotes and mildly dirty jokes acceptable to the largely Baptist crowd. For me, however, his stories about family history, especially those involving Civil War veterans, could keep me glued to an uncomfortable lawn chair for ages. As an aside, I remember once visiting their home in South Boston, Virginia. Unlike Aunt Ida Mae's home, Edna's was spotless, and every piece of furniture in the house, much of it vintage, 1950s Haywood Wakefield, a dream come true for collectors of post-war modern, was covered in vinyl slipcovers. Vinyl runners traced the paths from room to room and right to the front door. One could have performed surgery in the living room, it was so clean. I was saddened to learn about 20 years ago that Edgar and Edna died, childless, within just a few months of each other, which was probably a blessing given their devotion to each other. As Aunt Nancy liked to say of deceased family members, they've gone on to glory. The family still gathers each September, with only a few survivors remaining of that generation that had built up the reunion during the lean years of the 1930s and 40s, when the ethos of close-knit family really meant something. Their numbers no longer legion. Around 30 people gathered last year at a cousin's home for another day of eating and storytelling. But the connection to place and history isn't as strong, my mother reported, nor is the generations-old bond to the land. The family has dispersed, leaving the red clay soil of the Virginia Piedmont for more prosperous climes. Only a few cousins, in fact, still grow tobacco, holding on to some closely measured Jeffersonian ideal in a threatened market they no longer comprehend. My grandfather, eldest of 10 and tired of being land rich and cash poor, departed in 1941, driving his clay-stained Plymouth down Route 58 to find work in the rapidly expanding war industries of Norfolk. He would visit often, of course, returning up home, as he called it, dragging us to family graves and the crumbling foundations of old homesteads, now slowly yielding to forest and kudzu. With my grandmother's passing in October, the last of that storied generation with whom I always felt a tangible connection to a much more distant past, the last who literally knew where the bodies are buried, passed into memory. Thanks.